Good evening and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Wesley Whitaker and I'm one of your Ath Fellows this year. Like many people during last year's election season, the nasty political rhetoric exchanged at the national level trickled down into conversations with my friends. After one especially animated argument with a friend from high school that left us both fuming at each other, it seemed like the only way our friendship could continue would be to simply not bring up the subject, or any political subject for that matter. Nevertheless, this arrangement seemed entirely unsatisfying. Neither of us would ever admit that our views were arbitrary. In fact, we both claimed that our political stances embody our personal values, and I found it hard to stay in touch with someone who felt so differently about what was fair, what equality meant, and what was right. Months after the inauguration, I eventually broke down and violated our unspoken but crystal clear agreement to not discuss politics. I sent what I thought was a very well-written and fair article from the Washington Post detailing the GOP's replacement plan for the ACA. Instead of captioning my message with an argument or what I thought was a well-deserved "I told you so," I fought the urge and simply wrote, "Any thoughts?" Unfortunately, even this more innocuous approach didn't lead to a productive conversation, as the only response I got was an emoji rolling its eyes. It's no secret that polarization in our country is at an all-time high. Tonight, our speaker will examine the origins of this pattern of polarization and suggest ways that our educational institutions can challenge them. Jonathan Zimmerman is a professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania, whose scholarship focuses broadly on the ways that different people have imagined and debated education across time and space. His most recent work, co-authored with Emily Robinson, The Case for Contention, Teaching Controversial Issues in American Schools, examines campus politics in the United States, including controversies over diversity, sexual assault, and political correctness. Zimmerman's academic work has appeared in the Journal of American History, the Teachers College Record, and the History of Education Quarterly. Before teaching at Penn, he taught for 20 years at New York University, where he won NYU's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2008, and where he also served as the chair of the Department of the Humanities and Social Sciences in NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Author of several books, he has received book and article prizes from the American Educational Research Association, the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, and the History of Education Society, where he served as president from 2009 to 2010. Before joining academia, Professor Zimmerman was a Peace Corps volunteer and a public school teacher where he taught social studies. Now, Professor Zimmerman's Athenaeum presentation is co-sponsored by the President's Leadership Fund. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please silence and put away your mobile devices at this time, and please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Zimmerman to the Athenaeum.
Jeez. He forgot the part where I cured cancer. Thank you, Wes, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to Priya and Hiram for inviting me out here, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I mean, God, the only thing I can conclude is that the food is really good, or there isn't a lot to do in Claremont. And thanks also to my oldest childhood friend, Paul Leonard, coming down from Oakland for this. He clearly doesn't have a lot to do either. If history is any judge, he will offer moral support by making fun of my wardrobe. Most of all, and most seriously, I want to thank the incredible teachers that our daughter Becca has had here at Claremont. I've spent my life as an educator, and I like to think of myself as a dedicated teacher. But people like Diana Selig, Lily Geismar, and John Shields, I'm not in their league. I'm not in your league. And I have just been incredibly impressed by the level of attention, the level of care, the level of instruction that you've given our daughter. All parents are narcissists at some level or another, and so we all exaggerate the amount of influence we have on our kids. We're the primary influence, but hardly the only one. The peer influences are massive, and so are the other adult influences. And my wife Susan and I, we are absolutely certain that our daughter is a more aware, a more analytical, and most of all, a more empathetic person because of the teaching that she's received from people like Lillian, Diana, and John. So thank you. So I feel incredibly lucky to be here because Becca's graduating. But I also feel really depressed about our political moment. And so this talk is going to be kind of a bummer, I'm afraid. It's an incredibly difficult moment for all of us as citizens and as educators. But my brief theme tonight, and I am going to try to keep it brief because I like hearing from other people more than myself, is that our educational institutions, both our colleges and universities and our K-12 schools, have not stepped up to the challenge that our moment has created. I'm going to briefly describe what I think is salient about the moment, and actually Wes described it, I think, better than I could. That will be brief, not particularly original, but very depressing. Then I'm going to talk about it as an educational problem, and again, argue that our schools have either ignored or exacerbated the problem, and that part will be hopefully a little bit more interesting, but also depressing. And then I'll give you a modest set of suggestions about what I think we as educators and citizens can do, and indeed should do. So it is a bummer. We hear a lot now about how Russians tried to undermine our democracy, and indeed they did try to do that. But each of us, especially for educators, needs to ask ourselves what we've done to address the problem of our frayed democracy, and I think the answer is actually not enough. I think sometimes we succumb to the same evil spirits that are out on the land, and actually we've made things worse. Briefly, what I think is unique and salient and depressing about our current political moment is, of course, the ideological segregation that's all around us. You can't blame it all on he who won't be named because it preceded him. And indeed, the Bill Bishop book, The Big Sword, although it's a few years old, I think it's still the best introduction to this. So in 1976, about a quarter of Americans lived in a landslide county. That means one that voted either Democrat or Republican by 20% or more. By 2008, half of us did. You're vastly less likely now than 20, 30 years ago to live next to somebody from a different political party. You're vastly less likely to date somebody or marry somebody of a different political party. And, here's the most depressing thing of all, the more formal education you have, the less likely you are to have a conversation with somebody of a different opinion. And that, friends, is the ultimate indictment of our educational system. Of course, it should be precisely the opposite. Education, if it's worth its salt, should act to expose you to things that are different from you. But in fact, we have some very good numbers suggesting that it works in precisely the opposite way. That the more education you have, actually the less likely you are to converse with people that disagree with you. There are all kinds of different causes and theories behind this. The way mass media works obviously has fed this. You've probably heard us old graybeards talk about the 3-channel monopoly. You know, when I was growing up, there were 3 channels you could get news from. Not everybody liked Walter Cronkite, but everybody watched him. Obviously, when you have 60 or 600 sources, you're going to have a lot more segregation with respect to what people consume. When a lot of political discussion happens online, it becomes often even more polarized, even more nasty. It's quite difficult to have what most folks would call a discussion with somebody you disagree with online. There's a mutual vilification that happens there. And of course, it is fed from the president. The president didn't invent it. But surely the president exacerbated it. Let's remember, the person who's our president called newspapers enemies of the people, threatened judges and reporters who criticized him, called his political opponents losers and dummies, echoing all the snark of the reality TV program that he created before he became our president. But friends, here's what's really important. I'll be honest with you, I yield to nobody in my loathing for President Trump and the way I think that his behavior, and especially his tone and his choice of words, has undermined so much of what I hold sacred in our democracy, our norms and practices of democratic life. I do think that's an enormous threat, but here's the second biggest threat: the way the rest of us imitate him. The Trumpian way in which the rest of us behave under the challenge of Donald Trump. So, if you oppose marriage equality, you are a homophobe. If you oppose the use of race in college admissions, you're a white supremacist. You're a white-splainer. You're a mansplainer. You're a racist. You're a sexist. You're an elitist. You're an ableist. Friends, these are often terms used by people who loathe Donald Trump like I do, but they are Trumpian at their heart. Trumpian in the way that they operate. Trumpian in the way that they substitute name-calling for argument. Trumpian in the way that they utterly dismiss and utterly vilify people on the other side. And they do, and they operate in awful and nefarious ways. At Bryn Mawr College, which is near where I live, a student last semester, this didn't make the national wires, although it should have. It wasn't last semester, it was in the fall. It was during the campaign. She posted something on Facebook saying, is anybody going to the Trump rally in Westchester, Pennsylvania? And the amount of vilification and hatred that she received via social media was so great that she dropped out of school. She just couldn't take it. There were thousands and thousands of messages calling her a white supremacist, calling her a racist, calling her a sexist, asking her to leave, saying she had no place in the community. That's Trumpian. What have our colleges and our universities done in the face of this? What have they done to try to create bridges, to try to create dialogues across these chasms? I would say not enough, and there are many reasons for that. Part of that is, especially at some of our elite schools, not all, there is an ideological monoculture. It's not absolute, but John Shields, who is here, can tell you more about this than I can. Among both faculty and students, there's a certain kind of shared ideology. Again, not absolute, but the fact that there's so many people that are in one camp obviously makes it difficult to create conversation across these camps. But there's more. I think one of the other problems is the low overall quality of teaching in higher education. Not enough people have made this connection, and I'm going to try to make it in my next book. Look, I began this talk by thanking the amazing teachers that Rebecca has had here at CMC, and she has had them. But there are 4,000 places to get a BA in the United States, and most of them don't put anything like the premium that CMC puts on teaching. There's an enormous literature, some of it created by my friend Richard Aram, who was my colleague at NYU and is now the dean of the Ed School at Irvine, around the corner, sort of. The news is really, really bad. The number of students who say that they have been engaged in a course, the number of students who say that they feel their professor is invested in the course, and most of all, the number of students who say, and this is really important, that they've engaged in a discussion in a course is shockingly low. Most students in this country report that they never engage in what they call a spirited or personal discussion in a classroom. Given that, should we be surprised that they can't or won't do so in the public sphere, I don't think we should be surprised at all. None of this is natural. Nobody comes out of the womb saying, you know, well, I'm going to listen to you and tolerate what you say, even if I don't agree, and not kill you. Well. In fact, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that that's not natural at all, that in fact it has to be learned. And if the quality of teaching is so abysmal that people aren't exchanging ideas back and forth in the classroom, why should we expect them to know how to do it? But there's more. It seems to me that our universities have embraced one of the most troubling aspects of our popular culture, one of the most troubling cultural shifts that I describe in my book about campus politics, which is what I call the psychologizing of politics. That is the tendency to express political ideas or to try to have political discussions in psychological terms. Let me be clear, I'm not against psychology. My family and I have been great beneficiaries of psychology. But I don't think psychology and politics play well. I don't think psychology provides the proper idiom, or even sometimes any idiom, for political discussion. Friends, if you tell me that you were microaggressed or triggered or offended by something that I said tonight, I have pretty much one thing to say in response. Sorry. Honestly, I got nothing. I got nothing else. I would never say that you weren't. I can't look into your soul and tell you what you felt. When I make this plea, often people in the audience will say, you're denying people's feelings. And I want to emphasize that I'm not. It's precisely the undeniability of feelings that makes them such a poor venue for discussion. Where does this come from? Well, it's of remarkably recent vintage, and I'm still trying to figure out the history. The term microaggression was actually coined in 1970 by somebody that everyone has forgotten, who was a psychiatrist at Harvard, whose name was Clarence Pierce, African-American psychiatrist who described microaggressions as subtle, indirect, unconscious insults, often unintended. But nobody paid any attention, and I found almost no reference to it until the 2000s. And it was revived mainly by a guy who teaches at Teachers College at Columbia, whose name is Gerald Wing Sue. And he starts creating glossaries of microaggressions, and also making an argument about their cumulative effect on the American psyche. And here's Gerald Wing Sue. It's not the white supremacist KKK members or skinheads who pose the greatest threat to people of color and other minorities, but instead well-intentioned people, strongly motivated by egalitarian values, who see themselves as fair-minded and decent people who would never consciously discriminate. It's the racism that knows not its name. And listen to the argument here. It's worse than the people that we saw with the tiki torches and the crosses. That's what he's saying. Because their racism is out in the open, right? This is so subtle that sometimes you don't even realize you're doing it. And they can take different forms, some of which highlight your difference and some of which erase it. So where are you from? That's a microaggression. Asking an Asian student for help with math, that's a microaggression, because both of these claims, the argument goes, reinforce distinctiveness. But here's what's really interesting about microaggressions. They can be bad for the opposite reason, that they minimize distinctiveness. So when I look at you, I don't see color. There's only one race, the human race. The US is a melting pot. These are all microaggressions, allegedly, not because they highlight distinctiveness, but because allegedly they erase it. Now, you should know that at the Cal universities, and I think there are 11, 10 created trainings and policies drawn directly from the Gerald Wing Sue glossary, and held training sessions for faculty and staff, drawing exactly on that glossary, sometimes adding their own microaggressions. My favorite one is politically correct. That's a microaggression. It accuses, the argument goes, people of color of being too sensitive. So in the era of microaggressions, PC is no longer PC. Even discussions of microaggressions can be microaggressive. So at Brandeis, there's an Asian American artwork featuring examples straight from Gerald Wing Sue. So the Asian American Society put it up, and it says Asians are good at math, I don't see race, and so on. Other Asians at Brandeis denounced the exhibit as microaggressive, and in an email, the head of the Asian Society did a big mea culpa, and she said, I'm sorry to anybody that was triggered, hurt, or microaggressed by the content of our public art piece about microaggression. Friends, look, I know some of these comments can be insulting, absolutely. And in the proper or in certain context, I might be offended by some of them myself. Here's the problem. The problem is making offense the rubric for any of this. Look, anyone who tries hard enough in America can make it. That could be offensive given the context or depending on the context. America's a melting pot. I could imagine certain contexts where that might be offensive. What I object to is the idea of a university taking a normative stance on a controversial question, like in the first case, social mobility, or in the second case, assimilation, to protect people's psyches. Social mobility and assimilation are some of the most hotly contested questions in American letters. The idea of an educational institution taking an official position on one of those issues in order to protect people's allegedly vulnerable psyches, that's anathema to the principles of the university as I understand it. It's creating a psychological inhibitor on a discussion of absolutely central political and social questions. Trigger warnings, if you have to know, this is a little dweeby, but the genealogy is different. They don't come from academia like microaggressions, they come from the feminist blogosphere. They come from the 1990s, where more and more people started to get access to the web, and feminist groups started to create triggers for material that might have to do with sexual violence or sexual trauma. This strikes me as an entirely legitimate enterprise. And although I don't call it a trigger warning, I should tell you that sometimes in my class, especially over that issue, I've given warnings. So in my class on the culture wars, I do a unit on pornography, and one of the things I do is I show a movie by a friend of mine called The Price of Pleasure. It's an anti-porn movie by a feminist filmmaker, but one of the ways it tries to make its case is by showing you some really ugly, violent, misogynist porn clips. And what I do is I describe what's in the movie for students, and I say, if you don't want to watch this, you don't have to. Look, I don't call that a trigger warning, but for all practical purposes it is, right? It's just letting people know that there's going to be some extremely upsetting material. That seems to me entirely legitimate and fine, until people start demanding trigger warnings for, and I'm going to list them, these are all things that have happened, trigger warning for anything about pregnancy, a trigger warning for anything about addiction, a trigger warning for anything about bullying, a trigger warning for anything about suicide, and my favorite, a trigger warning for anything about Downton Abbey. Look, there's some bad shit in Downton Abbey. Seriously, there is, you know? But come on, all right? At one of our major American universities, somebody in a horror movie course, a student about horror films, demanded a trigger warning before bloody scenes. Now, come on, this is an elective, all right? And it's elective about horror movies. If you don't like blood, this seems to me an entirely legitimate thing, you probably don't want to take that course. But look, like, you know, in King Lear, this is not altogether fool, my lord, right? It's easy to find these ridiculous examples, all right? And it's not about the examples. Here's what it's about. It's about the argument. It's about the language of psychology, which, yes, teaches us to feel a certain way. Arlie Hochschild, who's taught at Cal for 40 years, in her book, The Managed Heart, she coined this very useful term called feeling rules. What are feeling rules? Feeling rules are the sociological scripts that bias without determining how we feel. So everyone's a subjective being, everyone feels differently, but there are social scripts around us that influence without determining the way we feel. I would suggest that all this activity I'm describing, although it sounds ridiculous, is actually operating to create a set of feeling rules that actually make people more likely to feel the negative emotions that we're trying to protect them from. So, to give you a good example, you may recall a few years ago, somebody broke into Harvard Law School and defaced the portraits of the faculty of color by putting black tape over their mouths. And this led to this huge contretemps. There were big protests outside of Harvard Law School, all sorts of statements about the trauma, and that word, of course, was used, that people had felt. Well, in the New York Times, Randall Kennedy wrote a really interesting op-ed about this that you may want to Google sometime, because Randall Kennedy, of course, is an African-American professor at Harvard and one of the people whose portraits was defaced. And he made a couple really important points in the op-ed. The first thing he said is, we don't know that this was a racist act. And actually, we don't. I mean, this could have been somebody that was trying to make a kind of performance art statement about the silencing of the faculty of color, or it could have been this horrible, terrible racist too, right? We don't know, but again, it's characteristic of our time that that was just the absolute assumption without any evidence, right? But the more interesting thing he said is he said, even if it was racist, how is it harming us? How exactly is it doing that? We know they're racists on the land. We know it now even better, all right? But doesn't it promote what Kennedy in his op-ed called an inflated sense of victimization to teach people that they should feel a certain way and even feel this thing called trauma? And by the way, that's a medical term. What do we do to the meaning of that term? How do we empty it of meaning when we apply it to anything that we don't like? You know, it's like people that call everything a lynching, you know? I mean, that just makes me crazy as a historian. Like I say, that bad thing, if you're calling it a lynching, look, you gotta learn more about lynching, all right? Because I'm sure it sucks, whoever you're complaining about, all right? Okay, but it's not a lynching, and if you think it is, go read about lynching. So the people at Harvard Law School claiming trauma after this defacement of these faculty portraits, I would like for them to go to a battered women's shelter or a Syrian refugee center and tell the people there that they too have experienced trauma. I would like to see that. I don't think they could do it. So, okay, what do our institutions do? Well, they rarely challenge this ideal, this system, which might be seen to challenge it as offending or triggering in its own right. Instead, I would say many of our institutions, not all, have reinforced these ideas and these feeling rules. How? Well, let's start by offering comfort stations for traumatized students after the election. Come on, if Hillary wins, is there a comfort station for traumatized students? I voted for Hillary. I didn't vote for him, okay? I was as upset as anybody. But a trauma station? Really? The programming around microaggressions. Remember, this isn't just an idea on the land. This is something that university administrations, university offices have embraced despite an incredibly weak research base. And by the way, Scott Lilienthal at Emory has done an incredible deep dive on this. It's not in my book because it came out afterwards, but scientifically, no. I mean, and when I say scientifically, like what a bunch of different people perceive as a microaggression, totally different, okay? This idea of 1,000 cuts, that microaggressions have this cumulative effect, zero evidence. There just isn't science to it. Maybe one day there will be, that's how science works, okay? But right now there absolutely isn't. It is not a scientific concept. It shouldn't surprise you, given all this, that students at our campuses report less support for free speech. They report less exchange and dialogue with people that they disagree with. You probably saw the report on the recent Brookings study where half of the students said it's okay to shout down speakers on campus. 1 in 5 said it's okay to use violence to prevent speech. Our students don't get practice speaking across these differences. They are afraid to offend each other. And given the premises I'm describing, I would be afraid if I were them too. All right? Who wants to be the person that causes that sort of pain and trauma in somebody else? I certainly don't. Given these premises, I would go quiet. I don't blame them. So we love talking about diversity, this and that, right? It's not enough to bring in students from diverse backgrounds or even from diverse opinion groups. We need to engage them in speaking across those differences. We will not do that on the grounds of psychology. Some places are taking this on directly. You might have read that Colorado College and the Air Force Academy are trying to mix those populations, which is a great idea. At Penn, what I've been doing is I've been creating political dialogues between students at Penn and students at Cairn University, which you haven't heard of. It's formerly Philadelphia Bible College. After the election, there were a small handful of Trump voters, and they came out to me in my office. They're like closeted gays, right? I mean, they can't say what they think. If you're a university professor, you should not be able to live with that, with people not being able to say what they think. You shouldn't be able to rest at night. These are small little interventions. I can't say where they'll go, but I'm going to condense here because, as usual, I'm talking too much. I think it's not realistic to ask our universities to shoulder this entire burden because obviously we get people when they're 17, 18, 19. And Carol Christ, the chancellor at Cal, who is somebody that I think has done and said all the right things in the face of enormous pressure from many sides. The most interesting thing she said before the Free Speech Week that didn't happen up at Cal, didn't get a lot of press, but she said, quote, "Students come to us skeptical of free speech. They've been socialized to avoid bullying and any attached offense. Their safest bet is to avoid controversy, so any real solution will have to start much earlier." And I think that's right, the other book that I wrote in this zone is about the teaching of controversial issues in K-12 schooling. And if you'll see it, it's a very, very small book. It's like Great Jewish Sports Heroes, because actually, when you go in and look in the schools, there's shockingly little teaching of controversial issues. Every school district has a policy saying they support it. But when you actually try to measure it, and most of all when you interview students, you find that there's shockingly little. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of them, alas, is that teachers often report that they're not prepared to do it. That is, it wasn't a part of their professional preparation. So one of the examples in my book, after the first Gulf War began in 1991, nobody remembers that one now, but there was actually a walkout of students in Pittsburgh because they complained that the schools were ignoring the war and the teachers weren't teaching about it. The kids who walked out all got a 2-day suspension, but the ringleader got a week-long suspension, and he had a brother fighting in the Gulf. And the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette followed this very closely, lucky for me, and they went and they interviewed some teachers about it, and they said, why aren't you talking about the Gulf War? And one of the teachers said, well, it's not in the textbook. It's like, dude, it happened last week. And if what you think teaching is just teaching what's in the textbook, maybe it's time to think about law school, all right? I mean, not everybody should be a teacher, all right? Also, in fairness to our teachers, there are just enormous demands on their time. One of the other things we chart in the book is what happened to the teaching of controversial issues after the accountability revolution. And the accountability revolution begins at the state level in the 80s and 90s after A Nation at Risk, and then it becomes a federal thing with No Child Left Behind. And the students in this room are children of No Child Left Behind. None of them were left behind. Look, they're at CMC, you know. But I think it's, you know, it's important to realize how radical No Child Left Behind is. Not like radical, like, oh, you know, I'm in Seattle protesting radical, just in a dictionary way, just an enormous departure from how we've done business in this country. You know, the idea that you're going to actually reward and sanction schools and sometimes teachers based on, you know, the performance of kids on tests is a remarkably new idea. And we argue in our book a hugely, hugely difficult and harmful one if you care about the teaching of controversial issues, because, you know, there is one right answer on most tests, and that's obviously what teachers are going to teach, rather than engage you in questions that don't have them. Another big inhibitor is the lack of legal protections for teachers on this subject. So in 2007, there was an important case involving somebody named Deborah Mayer. And this is really gloomy, really depressing, but everyone should know about it. Deborah Mayer was a teacher in the Bloomington area of Indiana. And in 2003, the second Gulf War, she was teaching a current events lesson from the district-sanctioned current events magazine, you know, Time for Kids. And you may recall in the build-up to that war, it was clear we were going to invade Iraq. It wasn't clear when, and there was a big demonstration at the mall in Washington. There's an article in Time for Kids about this with a picture of a demonstration. And a kid in the class says, Ms. Mayer, have you ever been to an anti-war protest? And she says in response, yes, as a matter of fact, I drove by one in Bloomington the other day and I honked my horn in support. And in general, I believe that people should try to settle their conflicts peacefully and without violence, which is why I'm the advisor to the peer mediation, whatever, at the school. Fired. Done. Yeah. I mean, there are teachers who've been fired in this country for lessons I taught as a high school teacher. I mean, look, there's enormous variation. I'm not trying to scare anyone, right? There are 14,000 school districts, and if Deborah Mayer did that, like at PS3 in Greenwich Village, she'd get the Teacher of the Year award, right? I mean, you know, it all depends on where you are. But the courts have upheld all of this. They also upheld the firing of an Ohio teacher who did the exact lesson that I did in South Burlington, Vermont in 1987, which is it's American Library Week's most censored book, you know, thing. Here are the 100 most censored books. Back in my day, it was, you know, Catcher in the Rye, Huck Finn, and now it's Harry Potter, Hunger Games. Pick one and report to the class about why it was banned. Fired. And friends, the biggest inhibitor on all of this is that maybe we don't want it. You know, Zimmerman has spent his career talking about this thing called democratic education and the need for dialogue. But what Zimmerman has never worked out is that the demos might not want it. And then what makes it democratic? This is a question that's hounded me throughout my career that I haven't answered. And the only thing I can say, and I'm just going to spend 4 more minutes before I conclude, is that, you know, Trump has been, in my view, awful for America, but he's kept me really busy. And what I've been doing the past 6 months is going to colleges and schools and making a plea for the kind of pedagogy that I think we need in order to teach each other how to do this. So, you know, we're not that far from Vegas. After all that, I went onto the web and I tried to find one school district that was doing what I want. I couldn't. They're all offering therapy, they're all offering comfort, and of course that's all fine and good, and they should, especially for kids that have been subjected to violence, all right? But how about a question like, how should we regulate guns in America? Newsflash, adults disagree about that. They do. Why do we pretend otherwise when the kids are in the room? And how will the kids learn how to have that dialogue if we don't do it? If we don't engage in it, if we don't model it. But as I've given these talks, I've found that there are schools and teachers who are trying to do this, and I try to give them a couple of what I call best practices for doing this, and they include distinguishing fact from opinion, real controversies from fake ones. Obviously, fake has its own baggage in this current political moment, but just to give you an example, whether human beings or human behavior has warmed the earth is a fake controversy, okay? The best informed people around the world all acknowledge that human behavior has. What to do about that is a real controversy, all right? And please understand, the fake part is bipartisan. One thing that drives me nuts when I give these talks is when people talk about the Republican war on science. Hey, friends, there is a war on science, all right? It is not Republican, it is bipartisan, all right? How many people in Boulder, Colorado, who scoff, appropriately in my view, at climate change denial, don't vaccinate their kids? And they're all Democrats, all right? So don't give me the Republican war on science, right? It's a bipartisan war on science, and one of your duties as a teacher is to distinguish, yes, fact and opinion. Another, and this is hard, is to avoid indoctrination. And what's indoctrination? Indoctrination is when you foist your own opinion on the kids. And it's hard to avoid that because you're the adult in the room and you're grading them. The most important one is to enforce rules of civility. And what I say to teachers is just what I say to my own students. You can vote for Trump. You can agree with Trump on any number of 50 things. That's totally fine. In fact, that's great. You can't act like him. You can vote for him. You can agree with him. But insofar as he flouts the norms of civility itself, you can't do it. Not on my watch. You can't. So what do our teachers need? They need our support to do this. We do get the schools and the universities that we deserve, and they'll only be as good as we are. So all of us, please, first of all, try to inform yourself about people you disagree with. I recently joined a gym, and I made just an absolute promise to myself that I would only watch Fox News at the gym. So that's all I do. Why? Because if I watch CNN or MSNBC, I will simply see my own views confirmed. All right? And on Fox, I don't. When you do engage with somebody of another point of view, use the right question. And the right question is not, how could you vote for that idiot? In our political dialogues, we've actually had to school people in how to do this, because they'll sit down across from a Trump voter and say, really? That clown? Instead of, so it's interesting, you voted for Trump and I didn't. Tell me why you voted for him. Same question, totally different idiom. Other rules, please avoid the name calling, the mutual stigmatization. You're a libtard, you're a loon, he's a wingnut. Stop! All right? Just enough. No more. Don't do it. Just say no. Don't be afraid of emotion. All these things are emotional, all right? But don't mistake emotion for argument. They're not the same, okay? Every wrong-headed and hateful person in history felt what they felt really deeply also. And finally, please support institutions that teach how to do this. If we want it, we need to persuade those institutions to do it. We need to make a case for teaching our kids in a different way. So I had an amazing experience, and this will close things. Last week, I went to a Mennonite school in suburban Philadelphia, and the Mennonites are fascinating to me because they don't fit, and I love things that don't fit. The way they don't fit is that, especially the more conservative Mennonites, they're pacifists, and they're against marriage equality. So, like, if you went to Penn or CMC or anywhere else and you found somebody who was a pacifist, I would bet my now insubstantial life savings, thanks to CMC, all right, that they would support marriage equality. I mean, I'll bet my last dollar on it. Got to these Mennonites, not the case. right? It doesn't fit. But they asked me to come out to talk about how to talk about marriage equality. And I said, look, the most important thing is that we create a consensus just to talk about it. And please thank Joan, who was the teacher who invited me out there. Thank her for making this happen. And Joan stands up, this is in a chapel, and 300 people clap, and Joan is crying. And it was just an amazingly powerful moment. And then they sent me little cards that the kids had written in response to the chapel. And just to share one, thank you for coming to talk to us today. One thing that will stick with me was your point of viewing news from different outlets. From now on, I'm going to make an effort to check multiple news outlets before jumping to conclusions or confirming my own biased opinion. Most of all, I will never again call somebody that I disagree with a name. That won't make any of us better. So look, this is a small step. It's an incredibly small step, but all of us have to take it. Nothing will change unless we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. We will now have time for questions. Priority goes to students. Please raise your hand, and Wesley and I will come and hand you the mic.
Hello, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I really enjoyed your talk.
You're going to have to say who you are and what you study.
My name is Tobin. I'm studying economics and government.
Ooh, that's scary.
You touched on this issue of giving teachers kind of more flexibility to discuss controversial issues in the classroom, but also you talked about the dangers of indoctrination within the household. It seems like while there's been unfortunate collateral of cases where restricting teachers from touching these issues has gone too far, how is there not still a continuum from indoctrination in the household to indoctrination in the classroom when you have local school districts that are going to be extremely biased just based on where they're located? It seems like it's going to create more situations where there can be that indoctrination. How do you draw the line?
Well, Tobin, that's a great question. And first of all, I think I wasn't precise enough. I mean, I was actually warning about indoctrination within schools, not within families. But you're absolutely right. I mean, one way of thinking about child rearing is a process of indoctrination. My father was in the Peace Corps. He was a Kennedy Democrat. And what do you know? I joined the Peace Corps, and I'm a Democrat. What a coincidence. Would it be fair to say that my parents indoctrinated me into a certain brand of liberalism? Absolutely. I think the more interesting question is, to what degree should parents' views be trump cards, to use a very, very loaded metaphor, right? My column yesterday was about guns and the need for discussions about guns. And I went onto the net and I looked below my piece, which is always a dangerous thing to do. And several people said, if Zimmerman were leading a discussion in my kid's school, I would leave the school. So, in the piece, I tried to be eminently fair. That is, I tried to say that the country is clearly divided on this question. And I tried to make the case for why we should have a discussion. But I think the person posting there doesn't want to have that discussion. A, doesn't think it's the role of the school to sponsor that discussion. Okay, and B, doesn't want their child exposed to that. And so this is the great problem, and those of us who believe in the discussion have to set aside our own predilections and most of all be willing to lose. Friends, a discussion with a preordained outcome is not a discussion. It's a pseudo discussion. It's a BS discussion. If you know where it's going, if you've cooked the books in that way, all right, you're simply invoking the language of discussion to get your way. If you believe in this process, you have to be willing to lose. And if you're not, shut up already about democracy and critical thinking. All right? So can we create enough of a consensus in this country among people who are willing to have a discussion no matter where it goes?
Thank you so much for that talk. My name is Shreya. I'm from Bangalore, India, and I'm a sophomore.
She was at the head table. just saying.
Yeah, and I'm also studying international relations and psychology. So my main question is that back home, we don't have just two political parties. We have many, just as we have many gods from the religion that my family raised me, in terms like indoctrination, question mark. But my question is that in American society today, where do you think people who don't lie into any one of these two categories, what is the role that they have to play in creating a bipartisan conversation?
Well, look, I mean, this is also a great question because one of the ironies that the political scientists keep telling us is that, you know, there's a lot more consensus on certain political questions when you try to measure them with respect to what the voters say than you would get if you just watch C-SPAN and watch people blyovating in Congress, right? That for a whole variety of reasons that the political scientists in here could describe better than me, you know, the system actually privileges a certain kind of extremism, right, within both parties. But look, you know, I think that one of the things that we're finding is that party affiliation is a huge part of people's identity. And check this out, this is spooky. It's partially inherited. Yeah, it is. It is. The twin studies show it. So, you know, you take fraternal twins and you take identical twins who have been raised in different places. The identical twins are more likely to share a political affiliation, right? That's not to say it's, quote, inherited, there's Republican DNA, but there is an inheritable part of it. So these identities are real. And yet, okay, I think what your question points to is that in a strange way, they've also become weakened, which is an opportunity, right? So, you know, they're Democrats and Republicans. They feel these things very deeply. I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, or I'm on the left, I'm on the right. But in fact, when you look at their political opinions, they don't necessarily accord with the leadership of the party. Sometimes they're disaggregated in all sorts of wacky and weird ways, as in the Mennonite example, right? And I would say, again, this is an educational problem as much as a political one, right? Because those voices are going to get lost unless we teach people how to recognize them and hear them, right? Because everything in the political sphere is going to be, to a degree, bifurcated, right? And it's going to fail to capture those kinds of nuances. And again, I think that's all the more reason why we need to, in our educational institutions, create venues that listen to and respect them.
Hello, my name is Hattie. So I feel like your argument is implying that there was a time in history, in American history, where there was some sort of a venue and a tradition of free speech in schools. Is that correct? Or
Oh, no. No, totally wrong.
Are we worse off? Are we better off?
No, there's no golden age. It's always sucked. All right. This is like Larry David imitating Bernie Sanders, right? You know, it's like, it's a disaster, and it really has been. Yeah, please.
So why is it urgent now?
Sorry.
So why is it urgent now, if has been the case?
Look, I mean, here I won't tell you the whole story because it will take too long. But this is the story that we tell in our book on controversial issues. And thank you so much for the question, because it points to one of the enduring myths about the founding of American education, common schools. And that myth is that the schools were created to create venues for controversial discussion. It's actually the opposite. If you look at figures like Henry Barton and Horace Mann, they're literally riding circuit around the Northeast and the Midwest part of the United States, trying to get taxpayers to ante up for common schools. And Horace Mann says quite explicitly the schools should avoid anything remotely controversial, because if you piss off somebody, all right, they're not going to vote for schools. All right. Let me find this. Oh yeah, you got to hear this. This is Horace Mann, 1844. If the day ever arrives when the schoolroom shall become a cauldron for the fermentation of all the hot and virulent opinions in politics and religion that agitate our community, that day the fate of our glorious public school system will be sealed, and a speedy ruin will overwhelm it. And remember, Horace Mann, he's, anti-slave, temperance, right, prison reform. I mean, he's a political creature, right? But he's actually making a plea for insulating the school from all that politics, because he feels that if one side or the other is alienated, they won't vote to create schools. Now, the story we tell in our book is there's kind of this contrapuntal, like this staccato rhythm, where in succeeding generations, or that was the wrong metaphor, but in different generations, there's a little bit more space for discussion, and then the space narrows. So during the so-called progressive era, you see actually more political discussion in the schools, in part because there's a new ethos about what the schools should do and what citizenship means, and you see the current events lesson, which, by the way, the current events lesson was actually a promo by newspapers to try to get kids to read newspapers. That's how it all began. It's one of the stories we tell in the book. But, clip out something from the newspaper, bring it into school, talk to your friends about it. My sister lives in central New Jersey. She has 2 sons, and when one was in middle school, the teacher gave this assignment, just what I said. And one of the kids in the class said, where do we get a newspaper? Like that ancient object with print. The kid knew where the newspaper was. So that's the progressive era, but during World War I and in wartime in general, it narrows. During the Great Depression, okay, it widens a little bit. Okay, during the Cold War, it absolutely narrows. In the 60s and 70s, the era of the armbands in schools and Tinker v. Des Moines, a little bit wider. And we think since the 80s, it's narrowed. And so what does this suggest? It suggests we got to get away from the myth-making about these institutions being like born to discuss controversy. They were born in controversy. Schools, the creation of schools was itself controversial, but they were not created to discuss controversy. And yet I do think when you look over the broad sweep, okay, which I just bowdlerized, there are absolute moments of opportunity, right? It's not all bad news, okay? It's an accordion, all right? And I think that should give us a modicum of hope.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, Professor Zimmerman. My name is Mohammed Batal. So I've talked to you a decent amount about this topic, and I really enjoyed it. And the answer to this question very well might be we need to learn to walk before we can run, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. During the talk, you said if you tell me something that I said offends you, pretty much the one thing I'm gonna say is I'm sorry. But on an interpersonal level, if we're concerned with dialogue and sort of understanding how why different people think different things, shouldn't you be asking why rather than saying I'm sorry? Because I totally agree that the problem is making offense the only relevant metric. But can we ask why and then subjectively determine the legitimacy of that claim, or why it would make you? And I get that that's a slippery slope because, I mean, different people's experiences, you should give different weight to different people's experiences. And so you might defer to an extent, but asking why, shouldn't that still be the first step?
No, Mo, I was deeply offended by your question, and I'm not going to ask why. Look, I think I misspoke, and I think it's an excellent question. I don't believe it should be a conversation stopper. I think that under the premises we've created, it too often acts as one, right? Because who can question a microaggression, right? We just had a training about it. Didn't you hear what they said? That's a bad thing to say. Moreover, won't you actually compound the injury and muddy the waters if you start to question whether it is in every instance a bad thing to say? I'm not saying we should stop the conversation. I would never say that. But I do think that we've laid down certain premises that serve as conversation stoppers, precisely because they put such an accent on people's internal states, you know? And it's all around us. I mean, I always tell my classes, look, my job is not to affect your feelings or your attitudes. That's not my ken. I don't walk out of a class saying, gee, I wonder how they're feeling. I walk out thinking, I wonder what they learned. I wonder if they were challenged. And let me tell you, like, if you're not discomfited in some way by something I do in class or something I said tonight, at least in some little way, I suck. Like, all I did was just confirm what you thought when you came in. Like, how does that get you closer to God? Like, I don't think it does, you know? So it's not like I'm here, it's not like I want to offend you, right? But like, things that contradict our deepest held beliefs, like, they are discomforting. I know I feel it, right? And what we have to do is be all right with that. And it's amazing, I've been studying these diversity trainings, they keep saying that in the diversity trainings, it's just they don't mean it. You know, because the other premises contradict that. And they do erect what are in practice conversation stoppers, even though they shouldn't be.
Hi, I'm Matthew Brunstad. I'm a sophomore at Pitzer. And I just had a question kind of about the recent events here, both at CMC and at the Five Cs in general. Yeah.
I was trying to
Nobody
avoid
brought it
that.
up. I was kind of surprised.
Yeah.
I was just curious because as an institution, or any institution really, you have the opportunity to give certain people essentially the soapbox and the platform to speak. And I was wondering, as, a supporter of free speech, like many people in this room, and I am as well, do you think that goes to the full extremes of the spectrum? So like, the Queer Resource Center incident, like very far on one side, and then Heather McDonald not so far on one side, and as much as the freedom of protest is an option, I don't think you can block someone from entering a building. But I don't know, I was just curious, like if Richard Spencer wanted to speak here, would that be something CMC is kind of obligated to give him the opportunity to do? Because, it's just one kind of extreme, but like I think as an institution, you have a responsibility to stay within certain bounds. And I think extremes on either end of the spectrum are kind of unacceptable, but I was wondering what and I think they're polarizing, which is another issue you talked about, so I was wondering if you could speak about that for a little bit.
Well, look, I'm glad you brought up the Richard Spencer thing, because one of the other profound experiences I've had over the past couple weeks, and it has been such a, it's just been a whirlwind. I was in Charlottesville, and I know that John Shields is a product of UVA, and I'm sure there are other people here who are. Let me tell you something. The issues that Matthew are raising are just a lot more just in the frontal lobes there. You know, as soon as I got there, I thought somebody would ask me about Heather McDonald. What I didn't expect when I got to Charlottesville is that everyone I met would say, what are you going to say about 8/12? I'm like, 8/12? 8/12? August 12th. Like, they talk about it like you and I talk about 9/11. Like, I hadn't heard 8/12. 8/12? Right? Is that what time is it? 8/12? Right? But look, you know, if you were there on that Saturday and you actually saw the parade, it's different from seeing the Vice video, you know? And, you know, there were a couple people in the audience who had actually seen the car driven by the murderous Nazi that killed Heather Heyer, you know? And Zimmerman's up there doing his rap about how, you know, we need to have discussion and we need to avoid name calling. And a couple people just got up and said, no, we need to stamp out white supremacy. And we need to do it in whatever way that we can. And if you had been at the parade, that's what you would want to do. Well, look, I do want to do that. right? And I think most Americans actually do. Alas, not all, but most. The question is how, right? And it strikes me that the worst answer is to call everything you don't like white supremacist. That is the worst way to get this job done. You know, does white supremacy exist? It absolutely does. And you know, the kind of raw Jew hating that I see on my email, I thought it was just on my email. I mean, look, if you have a Jewish last name, they will write to you. And you learn over the years, you know, that they have like 3 sort of signature entryways. And my favorite one is, just what kind of name is Zimmerman? It's Jehovah's Witness. Wait, well, what do you think? You know, but it's there, okay? And I think it's really good that we were all reminded, I was reminded, and everybody else, that it's there. To take Matthew's Richard Spencer question, I would never want Professor Chodosh to invite Richard Spencer to speak in the Ath or anywhere else, and I'm quite confident that he would never do that. To me, that's a no-brainer, because by inviting Richard Spencer, you're giving him a certain kind of imprimatur, right? But that's very different than if Richard Spencer suddenly appeared at College Street and walked onto Dartmouth Street and started to say his awful shit. There, I don't get in the way. I didn't invite him, okay? I've made it clear that I find him repugnant, all right? But it will do the cause of racial justice no advantage for me to try to set myself up as the arbiter of everything that's said on our campus. I just think that's an enormous mistake. Sorry, I didn't hear your name.
Hi, my name. I go to Pitzer, and I just wanted to talk about some of the comments you made in your talk. You dismissed trauma centers after Trump's election as ridiculously oversensitive, and I feel that you're able to do that because the Trump administration has probably not resulted in trauma in your life. But your dismissal of the role of emotions in politics ignores the reality that people have personal stakes in these political conversations. It's one thing for me to debate DACA legality with you as 2 people relatively distant from that policy. It would be another thing for me to debate it with an undocumented student whose entire livelihood may depend on DACA legislation. What's your response to this? Is everyone on equal ground in these political conversations, or do you recognize that some participants come in with the privilege of not having to actually care about racism or sexism or any other number of things that may come up?
It's a great question, and let me be clear. First of all, I want to reinforce this. We don't live in an equal country, right? There's no serious person that thinks that we do, okay? We all have radically different experiences, and those experiences will affect the way we react to everything, including our emotions. Look, I didn't hear your first name. Avalon. Avalon. The question isn't whether people will feel different ways based on their experience or based on what kind of threat they feel under, as in the case of DACA. Of course they will. It would be ridiculous to imagine otherwise. All right? That's not the question. To me, the question is whether we should limit our discussion and our speech in accord with those emotions. To me, those are 2 absolutely different questions. I think it's a profound example, and I absolutely agree with you. All right? I agree that these things are going to play out differently in people's lives, okay, depending on who they are, right? We're a nation of 300 million people, and we're different from each other. But we cannot become a democratic nation if we allow those differences and the different emotions they spawn to inhibit our dialogues with each other.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Please
That's
join
it?
me in once again thanking our speaker, Professor Zimmerman.
Thank you. Thank you.